Matt Helmers here at Iowa State University and director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and faculty member that is involved with the Iowa Learning Farms project, or one of the faculty members. And so really, again, thank you for attending one of our conservation webinars. These are all archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website. So if there's maybe a topic that you wonder if there's a webinar on, it's likely there is. So feel free to go and watch something. And this week, we are really fortunate to have Dr. Emily Zimmerman, that's a assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management and Global Resource Systems in the Department of Horticulture at Iowa State University. And so Dr. Zimmerman has been doing a lot of work with the agricultural conservation planning framework. And so she's going to give us kind of an update on application and recent updates to enhance conservation planning. As usual, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we will get those to Dr. Zimmerman at the end of her talk. With that, Emily, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for the invitation to be able to be here today with you all. So like Matt mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ACPF and hopefully as well some recent applications and updates to the tool. Oops, there we go. So the main things I'm going to talk through today are what the ACPF is. So I recognize that folks who are online today, some of you may be familiar with the tool, and for other folks, it may be something new. Talk a little bit about how it works, where it's applicable, and then who the tool could be used by. And then I'll wrap up today with just some recent developments and hopefully some future directions of the ACPF. There's been a lot of really exciting changes. So recently, the ACPF National Hub has been funded here at Iowa State. And then there's additional agreements that are working on new tool development, both on an economic and outcomes side, as well as just expanding the tool's current efforts. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to just frame conservation planning really, really briefly, just to kind of set up sort of why the tool is relevant and how it might be most useful. I recognize that a lot of us here are very familiar with the things that I'm going to chat about on the next few slides, but I do want to set up sort of the why for the tool itself. So we know that excess nitrogen and phosphorus from our agricultural fields can contribute to poor water quality outcomes, both regionally as well as locally. And so some of those challenges can be things like poor drinking water quality, eutrophication, reduced recreational opportunities, etc. So on a local level, we can see things like harmful algal blooms. You can see that in the photograph on the upper right-hand side of this slide. And those local algal blooms can really reduce recreational opportunities, and they can also be dangerous for animals or humans who might use those water bodies. You can see an example of a beach advisory in that photograph on the lower right-hand side of the slide. Again, those are things that we experience here in Iowa. And then more regionally speaking, we know that excess nutrients can contribute to Gulf hypoxia. So for example, you can see in that graph on the center of the slide that over the past 35, 45 years, there's been relatively large areas of the Gulf of Mexico where we've experienced hypoxic zones. And that even today, we're still well above sort of the goal in terms of reducing those regional effects from excess nutrients in our water bodies. And so, right, we've done a lot of work in Iowa and in the Corn Belt more broadly to start to address these issues. So one way we've done that is with the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, which set forth goals for non-point source pollutant reduction. And one of the primary ways that we've gone about achieving that is by implementing conservation practices on the landscape. We've invested quite a bit of money in that. So since 1995, Iowa's invested approximately $6.2 billion have been invested in Iowa alone. That's federal and state monies that have really gone to promoting conservation practice implementation. And you can see on an annual basis in this graph that those investments have varied anywhere from just north of $150 million to well over $400 million on an annual basis. And those funds have been really important, right? So we know that those funds have contributed really positively to programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, so land retirement, putting land into perennial vegetation, working lands programs like EQIP and CSP, where we're getting things like cover crops on the landscape, as well as riparian buffers. And so if we look collectively just at these three programs, there are about 110,000 active contracts and about 3.2 million acres in Iowa that are currently impacted by these really important conservation practices and efforts. But it's still, right, we still have really some really clear water quality challenges and some really clear opportunities to not only improve the production side of our agricultural system, but also to get those environmental quality goals that we're striving to reach in the nutrient reduction strategy. So there's still a lot of questions about, how do we identify the parts of the landscape that might be or might offer the greatest opportunity to install these practices? Where do we install these practices, or what are suites of opportunities to install these practices? And then how can we best work with landowners to explain the financial trade-offs and the expected outcomes of all of these practices, all these really innovative practices that are currently available for Iowa landowners to take advantage of? And that's really where tools like the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework can help leverage our resources most effectively. So for folks who might not be familiar with what the ACPF is, the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework is really just a science-based, data-driven approach to agricultural conservation planning. And it's operating both at the field scale, so individual farmers' fields, all the way up to small watershed scales. So in the neighborhood of Huck 12 size watersheds, so 25,000-ish acres. The tool itself is really designed to identify parts of the landscape where there might be opportunities to enhance our natural resources. So where we might be able to make gains in soil health and in water quality. And then in those parts of the landscape, what conservation practices or best management practices might be most relevant to address that resource concern and might fit best in that position on the landscape. The tool, I think, is really unique in that it recognizes that both farms and watersheds are really unique and heterogeneous. So the tool is able to identify, the tool and the user together are able to identify these localized areas of potential concern. So that would be related to things like phosphorus and nitrogen. And then the tool suggests all potential suites of practices that could occur in field, at the edge of field, or in downstream positions to really start to address those resource concerns. And I think one of the critical parts of this tool, and one of the things that I think is really great about this tool, is that it's not a prescriptive approach. So the tool is going to identify potential opportunities, identify potential suites of practices, and then it's really up to the conservation planner, the landowner, other watershed stakeholders to make decisions about what might work best in their watershed, on their farm, or in their field with their production system to continue to meet their agronomic goals, as well as meeting those environmental outcomes or environmental quality outcomes. So the tool itself, it's composed of essentially three different pieces. So the first is that the tool is based on general principles of agricultural watershed management. And you can see that really nicely defined in that pyramid on the right side of the slide. And this comes from a paper that Mark Tomer and his gang wrote in 2013, sort of the basis of the tool. So you can see that in general, the tool is going to focus, the bottom of the pyramid is always about building soil health. We also know that some of those efforts to build soil health are going to contribute positively to enhanced water quality and a reduction in nutrients. But we also know that that's often not going to provide us with the full opportunity, right? The full potential to reduce that phosphorus and nitrogen from leaving our landscape. And that's where the tool comes in to really help us to understand what are the opportunities for practices to control water and soil loss within our fields, at the field edge, and then in that riparian area. The second piece of the puzzle is really to begin to operationalize that framework that I showed on the last slide. So what that means is that we need publicly available geospatial data in this case to be able to actually run the ACPF tool itself. And so currently there is core data or input data that's publicly available across 11 states, just over 12,000 Huck 12 watersheds in the Corn Belt to actually run the ACPF tool. So you can see in that map on the upper part of the slide, the states that have the colored watersheds, those are areas that are currently available. And so what does the input data actually look like? So if you go to acpfforwatersheds.org, the website of ACPF, you can download data that include 6-year land use and crop history information, soils data, field boundaries, and then HUC 12 watershed boundaries. And then the user would supply a digital elevation map, and those digital elevation model. And those digital elevation models come from the state. So, for example, Iowa has DEMs that are publicly available. And those base layers, those are all of the data that are required to run the ACPF tool. So really, it's all curated for you. You just download it and it's ready to roll. So once you've downloaded the data, those input layers or those core data, the tool is going to process those data to essentially result in watershed and field level alternative land use scenarios that integrate in all potential best management practices. So the key processes that the ACPF uses include things like preparing the DEM, so making sure water flows down, which seems intuitive, but it's actually pretty challenging. Developing stream networks and catchments, characterizing fields, so really identifying where we might see areas of nitrogen and phosphorus loss based on tile drainage and on runoff risk. And then steps 4 through 6 are really about finding those opportunities or potential opportunities for citing best management practices. The ACPF is a GIS-based tool, so it works both in desktop and in Pro. And currently, we just released the 4th version of the tool. So it's available, again, along with the core data on the ACPF for Watersheds website. And then you can see on the far right side of this slide what this actually would look like in ARC Toolbox in the desktop or map version. And so when we think about those BMPs, right, the goal of ACPF is really to identify areas of resource concern and then use that to inform where we might place best management practices. So there are 9 targeted best management practices. You can see 7 of them here on the screen, as well as in-field practices that the ACPF can help users identify opportunities for. So those include practices that are designed to reduce phosphorus. So for example, contour buffer strips, water and sediment control basins, and riparian buffers, as well as nitrogen. So things like bioreactors, nutrient removal wetlands, and saturated buffers. So really trying to provide a full picture of what opportunities might be on the landscape. So what does it actually look like, right, when we think about what kind of information might be available from the ACPF outputs? So first of all, the tool itself can help to inform where there might be opportunities for areas of resource concern. So in the map in the center of this screen, you can see these fields that are darker in red. Those are going to be fields where we would be more concerned about the potential for runoff and phosphorus loss. And then you can see it's a little bit more difficult with this image, but the fields with the gray lines across them, those are fields where tile drainage is likely to occur. And so we might want to think a little bit about nitrate loss specifically from those fields. And then in addition to that, we can formulate and evaluate alternatives. So that's where the best management practice piece comes into the puzzle or into the equation. So you can see that in this particular scenario, there are bioreactors, contour buffer strips, and nutrient removal wetlands that have been identified as opportunities throughout different locations in this watershed. You can see this zoomed in image up here that provides a little bit more detail about where, for example, contour buffer strips are, bioreactors, and then nutrient removal wetlands. And all of this is again presented as opportunities for practice placement for landowners. So when we think about where the ACPF is applicable, this image is from a previous slide, but again, there are core data available for 11 different states and about 12,000 HUC 12 watersheds. Users can also create their own databases. So for example, if you're working in northern or even southern Michigan and you'd like to use the tool, there are utilities in the toolbox that can help you to assemble the core data in its format so you could use it in other places. And the tool is being actively used really across the Corn Belt. So the map on the right side of the screen is old. We're currently working on updating it, but it shows where the ACPF has been used. So you can see quite a bit of use in southern Minnesota, as well as across Iowa, and then smatterings throughout the Corn Belt, so Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and other states. And we think about who's using the ACPF, there's quite a diverse group as well. Again, I want to emphasize that the tool itself is intended to be run at the HUC 12 level. So you can see that in the map on the left side of the screen. That's a watershed in central Iowa. But you're really able to zoom into those field level as well. So if you're a landowner or a farmer, or you're working with someone who's a landowner or a farmer, it becomes really easy to see what are the opportunities or the concerns that might be on my individual farm or my individual field. And then how does that fit into the broader aggregate goals that we might be trying to achieve at the watershed level? So when we think about who the ACPF is used by and who can use it, I would say that it's really a diverse group of stakeholders right now that cross both public and private users and partnerships. So for folks who are actually running the tool, so that would be people who have those GIS skills to be able to download the data, run the tool, and then produce the outputs. It really varies across government, industry, and nonprofit organizations. So for example, we do have folks at NRCS offices who have played around with the tool a little bit, folks in industry, so a number of different consulting groups who develop watershed plans who are actively using and innovating with the ACPF, and then a number of nonprofit organizations. So a good example would be the Nature Conservancy, for example. And those entities, those folks who are actually running the tool, then they're taking those outputs and working with landowners and farmers, watershed organizations, and other stakeholder groups to really present the options, right? So these are all of the practices that might be suitable. How can we make these work for you folks? And you can see a picture of that happening on the right side of the slide. And then certainly researchers and scientists are also involved in this, innovating about the tool, evaluating about it, and really thinking about how we can best work with stakeholders to get the tool used for the right people in the right places. This is just an example of one person who used the tool. This is from our website. This is an example of James Martin, who was with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, using the tool in Buckeye Creek, which is in southeast Iowa. This is an example that's a few years dated at this point, but there are a number of different case studies that are available, sort of showing the tool and how it could be used. All right, so that's sort of the really fast version of what the tool is itself. And now I want to talk just a little bit for the rest of my time about some of the recent developments with ACPF, because we've been doing some really cool stuff here at Iowa State and in other places. So one thing I mentioned is that the NRCS recently funded the ACPF National Hub here at Iowa State. And really the goal of National Hub is to be able to increase the efficiency of NRCS staff's role in conservation practice implementation and improving water quality using the ACPF. I want to say that it's not just about the NRCS, that it's also working with our conservation partners, so industry folks, nonprofit folks, other government agencies, again, really to get the ACPF and its outputs in the hands of conservation planners and people who are working with landowners and other stakeholders. So as part of the ACPF National Hub, we're continuing to develop the ACPF geospatial data inventory. So that's really the core data that I talked about that's available for download. That includes developing, maintaining, storing, and updating those data, as well as the toolboxes. So that process is ongoing. Again, those data are available for download. At some point in the near future, we're also working on trying to be able to share ACPF outputs to make conservation practice implementation more efficient, particularly within the NRCS. So for example, if another entity runs the ACPF and is willing to share their results, could we make those ACPF outputs or results information available to organizations like the NRCS to be able to be used in the planning process? And then finally, the hub provides training and outreach for both GIS folks and conservation planners who might be interested in using the ACPF. There'll be some synchronous trainings that happen this fall, and there's asynchronous training that you can access via our website. And then finally, really supporting a network of ACPF users within the NRCS, as well as partners in conservation. In addition to the ACPF National Hub, there are sort of three other entities or three other recent developments that I want to highlight. First of all, we've had, with the National Hub, we've been working with a number of state and regional users of ACPF, so sort of user groups. That's been really exciting to see. We've held meetings with folks across the Corn Belt who are using the tool. And then in addition to the agreement here at Iowa State, there are two other agreements. One focuses on developing new tools. That's happening in Minnesota at a USDA ARS facility there. So I know that they're working quite extensively on sort of what tools to develop, what are areas of need. Certainly there's been some interest in thinking about water quantity tools as opposed to just water quality. So certainly some innovations from there to be expected soon. And then here at Iowa State, myself and a colleague in NREM, John Tyndall, are working on some tools around economic analysis as well as outcomes analysis from different conservation scenarios. And so I want to just briefly highlight the ACPF economic tool work, because those tools should be available for Iowa relatively shortly. So it may be of interest to folks. So the ACPF economic work, we call ACPF Fine Art, or Financial and Nutrient Reduction Toolbox. Essentially, what we realize is that the ACPF is producing all of these really excellent conservation scenarios, these menus of opportunities for landowners to think about best management practices. But there's not really a way in the ACPF to evaluate how much it costs and what kind of outcomes a landowner might expect from installing a practice, specifically as it would relate to nutrient reduction, and in this case, nitrate reduction specifically. So the ACPF Fine Art really offers an opportunity to develop and to use an ACPF compatible toolbox that provides users with information about nitrogen reduction benefits and costs that are associated with conservation scenarios. So to get at costs, the tool itself includes direct costs. So those are the costs that we would associate with actually putting in the practice. So things like site prep, installation, labor, basic management. And you can see an example of those costs on the right-hand side of the slide. So you're seeing, for example, variation in how much it would cost for a multi-purpose prairie strip versus a wetland or a bioreactor. So those are all of our direct costs. And on this slide, I have the 2020 dollars, but we've actually updated to 2021 dollars. So that update is in the tool now. We also calculate opportunity costs. So those opportunity costs are associated with practices where land is taken out of production. So like that wetland that you see in the lower part of the slide. To calculate opportunity costs, we use data from the soils data layer. So we essentially look at the corn suitability 2 rating. We do an area weighted average for the area that we would remove from production. And then we evaluate that CSR2 against county land rent proxy estimates to essentially get a $1 per acre rental rate that we would expect from the area that we placed in conservation. Just like the ACPF, we've made toolboxes to essentially run these tools. So you can see that there are two. The first one uses field boundaries and land use to calculate application of nitrogen. So depending on that crop rotation, and then it applies a nitrate leaching factor to understand how much nitrate might be lost from any given field. And then you can see in the second toolbox that we essentially, a user can decide which BMPs to put in this scenario. And then the outcomes from running ACPF Fine Art include things like which conservation practices, which fields have practices present, what are the opportunity costs and the direct costs associated with any given conservation scenario, what's the nitrogen load reduction potential, both at the field and the watershed level, and then what are total costs and the cost per pound of N reduced. So it really gives a full picture of what costs we might anticipate and then what outcomes we might anticipate as well. So just an example of this is from Big Creek Watershed in central Iowa. It's just to the south of Ames and north of Des Moines. You can see from the map on the screen that most of the watershed, this is actually two Huck 12 watersheds, most of the watershed is in corn and soybean rotation, so a highly agricultural landscape. This is Big Creek Lake here at the bottom of the watershed. It has some concerns around excess nutrients, so a positive watershed to actually test out some of our ACPF tools and innovations. If we run a scenario using the ACPF to identify opportunities for bioreactors, nutrient removal wetlands, and cover crops in the watershed, you can see how many opportunities there are. So there's 178 bioreactors. Most of our corn and soybean fields have opportunities for cover crops, and then 38 nutrient removal wetlands. This information is going to come from ACPF, so just running the tool. But then the ACPF financial and nutrient reduction toolbox is going to provide additional information about total cost, the amount of nitrate reduced in pounds and percentage, and the average cost effectiveness. And so you can see that there's a lot of variability among practices, so from bioreactors to cover crops. And there's also a lot of variability in the amount of nitrate reduction and the overall cost effectiveness. So again, these data are data that are coming from the ACPF Fine Art Toolbox. And even more sort of, I think, important than that, if we run the ACPF Fine Art Toolbox, we can start to understand how prioritizing conservation practices differently might yield both different costs and potentially different outcomes. So if you're working with stakeholders in a watershed or even individual landowners, understanding how to prioritize practices, how to prioritize different fields can be really important. So in this first row of the table, here's all of those potential practices that I showed you on the previous slide. Total cost of about $3.7 million, and we're looking at a nitrate reduction of somewhere around 59%. If we reduce the amount of nitrate that we're trying to reduce to just meet our Iowa nutrient reduction strategy goal of 41%, and then we actually prioritize practices differently. So we prioritize individual practices by how high their nitrate load reduction is, how low their cost is, or how cost effective they are to reach that same 41% goal. The cost changes quite extensively. In fact, if we're just looking at cost effectiveness compared to low cost prioritization, we have a difference of over $1 million. So that can really add up, right? When we're talking about Huck 12s, a difference of $1 million on an annual basis is a lot of money. So thinking about how to best prioritize which practices might be those really key opportunities is, I think, a really important potential use of this particular tool. You can also see variability in cost effectiveness. Again, we're looking at over $2 difference in terms of the average cost per pound reduced in some of these same scenarios to meet that same 41% goal. So this tool, I think, has some really nice practical applications. When we think about future directions of the ACPF, so I talked today about nitrate and in its applicability using the ACPF Fine Art. Obviously, the other part of that puzzle is phosphorus, right? So we're doing work right now to understand how we can best integrate phosphorus and sediment reduction into the ACPF Fine Art for evaluation. And then there's an opportunity to sort of expand direct cost and opportunity cost for the tool across geographic areas. There's interest right now from Illinois and Ohio, and the toolboxes will be available shortly for Iowa and Minnesota. And then other questions as well, right? What other ecosystem service outcomes and values might be important here? So there's been a lot of talk about carbon. Is there an opportunity to integrate things like carbon or wildlife habitat into ACPF Fine Art? In addition, are there ways and opportunities for additional tools? So certainly the group at ARS in Minnesota is starting to think about this. What other tools might be most appropriate? And then how do those tools change across geographic areas? So are there parameters that need to change? Are there different practices we need to think about? How does this look differently in different parts of the Corn Belt and across the country? Are there opportunities to think about policy, integration with other tools? We're currently doing some work with the Daily Erosion Project, but are there ways to integrate with other process models or other planning tools? And then finally, I think obviously increasing the accessibility and the applicability of the ACPF. So how do we continue to work on our collaborations with NRCS and other partners? And then are there ways to share our data more widely and more effectively through things like web-based services and applications, even just story maps like you see on the right-hand side of this slide. So as I wrap up, I want to thank a whole host of people. So I'm the one here talking about the ACPF today, and I'm certainly really passionate about it, but the ACPF is actually a result of a whole bunch of folks. I'm just one of those folks. So I want to give a particular shout out to Mark Tomer, Dave James, Sarah Porter, and Jess Van Horn, who were all at ARS. Sarah's actually back at ARS, but they're the folks who really came up with this idea and have worked very, very, very hard to promote this tool and its use. And then a number of people at Iowa State, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Minnesota, and Purdue, who have been really involved in the tool, its development, accessibility, evaluation throughout the past 5 or 10 years or so. And then certainly want to acknowledge that this work has been funded by USDA ARS, NRCS, US EPA, and several local entities, including the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And certainly we've experienced a lot of support from NRCS as well as state agencies. So particular shout outs to them as well. And so with that, I'll wrap up here and just want to make some of these resources available. So a number of the slides that I showed you, the information and data are available on the ACPF for watersheds.org website. So that would include database and tool downloads, examples of applications, our peer-reviewed publications, and then training if any of this would be of interest to you, either on the GIS side or on the conservation planning side. There are, again, synchronous and asynchronous trainings that are available there. And so with that, I think I'll wrap up. And Matt, I don't know if you come back on to chat about these slides or.
I can do that.
Okay.
While you take a breath or take a drink or something
that'd be
like
perfect.
that.
Thanks, Matt.
So I'll handle this part of it. So if you are on and need a CCA CEU, you need to send your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number to Liz Ripley by today at 5 p.m. And her email is ejukums@iastate.edu. So send that to Liz Ripley. Most of you that might be sending that, you know the drill by now. But and then maybe we'll go to the next slide to put in a plug for. We are going to hear about using biochar and zeolite to recycle P and N from swine manure next week. So looking forward to that, kind of another different topic. Feel free to type some questions in if you have them. We have had a couple come in and I can start going through those a bit. So the first one was kind of the connection with the drainage system. You know, we don't really know where drainage systems are explicitly in Iowa, but I think the ACPF does try to take into account what soils may be likely drained as far as siting and thinking about practices, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. So there's a part during step 3 of the tool that essentially uses the GSurgo soil information to identify fields where we think tile drainage probably is occurring. And that's, for example, based on the dual drainage classification in those fields, and then also the proportion of the field that would be hydric. And that's really a decision that the user can make based on what the user would know about local watershed conditions. Oh,
okay. So somebody, if they thought that there was kind of more drainage in that watershed than maybe coming from that's something they could adjust. Okay.
Absolutely. Yep. And again, the more local information that you know, the better the tool is going to work and the better the results are going to be.
Okay, great. No, I always learn something from Emily every time. I learned. Okay. So next one is, does the ACPF identify the 2-year floodplain and highly erodible land?
That's a great question. So no, it does not. And actually, it's funny that you asked that question. We're doing a little bit of work on some floodplain work right now. There's been some increased interest in thinking about floodplains and their potential for both water, not only water storage, but also nutrient attenuation. And so we are starting to think about the role of the 2, 5, and 10-year floodplain and what opportunities to integrate with ACPF there might be. I'm working with Billy Beck over in NRIM, sort of thinking collaboratively about that. And for highly erodible land, it does not outright identify that, but there are data layers in the tool that you could use to understand some risk around that. So for example, things like slope, soils, and distance to stream would probably help to understand where those places might be, but there's not sort of an outright step for that.
Okay. Next one. So your cost information, I guess the question is around, does it assume the individual practice implementation? And then, if we can reduce that cost via bundling or as we scale some of this up, I'm assuming the tool will be flexible enough that you could input new information about cost of practices.
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. So the tool right now, when we look at direct costs, those are just coming from partial enterprise budgets about what the cost of implementation would be on a state level. So it's a real average sort of assessment. And then the user can change that. So for example, if you know that in your county or your area, the cost of cover crops is a lot less than the assumptions that we've made, you can edit in the code. Essentially, it's really easy. Don't be intimidated.
When you say code, I get scared.
Don't be intimidated. It's really easy. You just go in and click and change a number. So that can be edited. And then the other thing I want to add is that as part of this agreement, this economics agreement with the NRCS, we'd like to actually start to integrate in some of those cost share data. So for example, if you were going to go with like CRP or EQIP or CSP, what would be the reduction in cost that your landowner or you might benefit from? So stay tuned for that. That's coming as well. Okay.
And one thing, I guess, the next question, and this was something I had written down as well, is thinking about, and I think one of your last slides had this kind of maybe some next steps, but maybe you might be able to expand on it, how we think about some of these practices having multiple benefits and how we factor in the cost with that, whether it's cover crops that might have some N&P benefits or, wetlands that might provide pollinator habitat, how we might think about that or factor some of that in.
Yeah, that's a great question. So like I said, right now the tool is just nitrate. And mostly, Matt, I know I've said this to you before, but we joke that we chose that because it's a need, but it's also the easiest one. It's the one that we felt the most confident in. And so now we're starting to expand our understanding of what other benefits these practices might derive. And cover crops are a great example, right? We know they have a nitrogen benefit. We know they have a phosphorus benefit, but they probably also have a lot of in-field benefits to farmers, right? So if you're going to graze them, soil health, infiltration, and we don't quantify those benefits at all. So how can we do a better job of stacking our understanding of what those benefits are? And that's going to increase the cost effectiveness of that practice and really reduce, the general cost. The other thing I'd say is that, again, we've heard a lot about carbon markets. So are there ways that we can begin to understand how to stack the potential financial opportunities in a legal way? It's a tricky question right now, but are there opportunities to do that so that landowners really are getting sort of the best benefit for their decision making? And we don't know we haven't crossed that bridge yet. So that's another stay tuned.
Yeah, and it seems like great opportunities to think about, especially for siting, where might be the greatest, the greatest bang for the buck, or where might landowners get the greatest return.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other part of that too is that how can we help landowners to understand the benefits that are most important to them, right? So if they're interested in nitrogen, but also wildlife habitat, where can they maximize both of those things on their property versus just the nitrogen piece of the puzzle?
So I know that, folks like Mark Tomer and David James have been, they spent a great portion, I won't say the bulk, but a great portion of their career working on this. I mean, in the time period you've been, looking at ACPF, have you seen more interest in kind of utilization of ACPF and kind of these approaches to thinking about it, about kind of siting of practices on the land?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So one of the really neat things, and I mentioned this very briefly, there's so many cool things to talk about with ACPF, but with the national hub that was just funded, one of the things we've been really lucky to be able to do is to meet with users of ACPF across the Corn Belt. So over the past 2 months, we've met with people in 6 or 7 states, I think. So we're meeting with folks from Iowa this week. And I'd say that the user groups are really diverse. So again, folks from industry, so who are using it to create watershed plans, folks from TNC, organizations like TNC and other nonprofits, Wetlands Initiative, all kinds of different kind of folks. And then NRCS themselves, right? They've provided a huge amount of funding and they continue to do that. And I think one of the primary reasons is that they see value in the tool and they'd like to get it integrated into their planning process. So I'd say that, over the course of the time that I've been working with the tool, it's really moved from an academic pursuit where we were asking questions about sort of how can we do this, what data are required, to really thinking about how can this better help us to implement conservation on the landscape. So that's been really, really exciting. And I think we're excited to see how that progresses. And I know I showed that map of where ACPF has been run. We're working to update that, and I would expect we'd see quite a bit more places turn up in that color, that red color.
Great. Couple of last questions. The cover crop cost didn't assume land out of production. I mean, it's just the cost of that cover crop, but also then the potential cost associated with any crop yield impacts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just direct costs, no land out of production. And we actually don't assume any yield decline or any yield bump. So it's just the cost. Yep.
And so, somebody made a comment here, which I think is right. And I use the terms not really interchangeably, I guess, but it indicated that, we need to understand the difference between cost and value. So we can probably figure out costs on a lot of these things, right? But figuring out the value or what might be financial benefits delivered by some of those might be a little bit where we're maybe a little more challenged.
100%. Yeah, we're pretty good as it turns. Thanks mostly to my colleague John Tyndall. We're pretty good at knowing direct costs, and we've even gotten pretty decent at estimating having a process to estimate opportunity costs.
Yeah.
But the benefit side, especially for things like that aren't like nutrient related, right? How do we quantify the value of pollinator habitat or pheasant habitat or infield things like infiltration? So we recognize that as a serious hole in our current process. And it's something that as part of that current agreement, we are working on to be better at. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yep. So kind of stay tuned. We'll have you back again to talk more about that. So
yeah, a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. The next, I guess, probably kind of the last question here is ACPF fine art, is it widely available yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is not available online yet. I would imagine, I think it'll be available within the next few weeks. We're doing some final testing with it and caught some errors that we wanted to resolve. Those have been resolved, and it should be available on the website again within sort of the next 10 to 14 days, I would imagine. And it is available for Iowa and Minnesota right now.
Okay.
But we are working with Ohio and Illinois currently to get the data for their states. So it will be available for 4 states, I'd say probably maybe looking at fall for Ohio and Illinois, but a couple weeks for Iowa and Minnesota. Okay. And I should say one last thing too, and I'm happy if anybody wants to reach out. We did just get a paper published that explains that tool in a lot of detail, and I'd be happy to share that if folks have an interest in that.
All right. With that, I want to thank Emily for a great presentation. Again, if you need the CCA CEUs, please email Liz Ripley by 5 today. So it'd be ejukums@iastate.edu, and tune in next week to hear about biochar. So thanks so much, Emily, and I'll give you the last word if you have any parting comments.
No parting comments. Just want to say thanks to everyone who joined today, and thanks again to Matt and Liz for the invitation. And please feel welcome to reach out if I can answer any questions or any follow-up.